Hey guys, please do not get mad at me for talking about something that everybody else is talking about. Hopefully I can give like my own take on it and hopefully it's interesting. It will be. I'm trying. I love you. I want to talk about inverted status. We should break down what it means and what it will mean for fashion, or I will break that down. So Fashioning Identity calls this flip, this is my favorite part of it, and I like scoured the book through this section to try to find different ways that they word it. Appropriating and inverting status symbols, intentional anachronisms, calculated duplicities, embracing a social paradox, calculated errors, the logic of wrong, inverting status markers, strategies of the wrong. Like, they just word it all these different ways, but what it's saying is like intentionally and strategically wielding something that is incorrect or not seen as high status in our society, and then making it into a high status symbol. So Fred Davis is quoted in the Fashioning Identity book as saying, appropriating and inverting status symbols, and they word, is at the center of developing like an outer sartorial identity. So when fashioning identity, appropriating and inverting status symbols is central to that, right? Which makes sense, like especially when we think of the most legendary fashion designers of our contemporary time. All of them not only appropriated like specific cultures, but did inversions of like time, status, aging, identity, high and low mixtures. And we see it as really clever because of the, you know, position that these symbols play in our lives, right? The philosophies behind these symbols and what they mean and how they shape the way that we interact with our realities. When these designers are able to flip that on its end, it's like a way of reshaping meaning for us in life, which doesn't always happen. Like, you don't usually go into your workplace and they're like, actually you're the boss and I'm the worker. You go in and they're like, just as yesterday, I'm the boss and you're the worker, and tomorrow it will be that I'm the boss and you're the worker, right? We don't have like meaning inverted and like flipped on its head very often in our reality. So I think it's quite exciting in fashion, right? Does that make sense? It does. So brands are using active status inversion, which seems to be going unaddressed because it's being reframed as almost like a neutral, and it's covertly blending status entirely. So this goes back to what I was saying about status ambiguity. Because we're seeing it as covert luxury, you're seeing it as like someone dressing normal but they're actually rich, but I think it's actually people dressing low end but they're rich, and so it's a flipping and an inverting of the status of something, not just like a kind of small transition up. Does that make sense? It's an active undermining of the meaning of specifically low status symbols and making them high status symbols through that contrast that they're creating. So I called it on Twitter, hello, the Prada knapsackification of fashion. So to me, this refers to Miuccia Prada taking over her family's namesake brand at Prada. So if you're familiar with the brand Miu Miu, it's named after Miuccia Prada. Miu Miu takes over Prada in 1978 with essentially no knowledge or consideration for fashion. She didn't study fashion, it wasn't interesting or important to her in her life, but she takes over her family's brand. And Prada as a brand was known as like a specialty luxury goods brand, right? With an emphasis on craftsmanship of leather goods specifically, and quality and conventional constructions of high luxury products. When Miu Miu comes to the brand, she kind of shifts their perception culturally. So she shifts the emphasis over to this edgy, futuristic, gender-neutral status symbol brand. She does this by reinventing their identity, specifically using the nylon knapsack, and this is something Ingrid Loschek identifies. So Loschek says that they represented urban mobility, which is a form of freedom, essentially, in my opinion. And it's acknowledging like the postmodern stressors of life and how everything can feel like it's converging in on itself. It's not about asserting status as a conventional status symbol. Look at how well this is made because it's leather. It's about transporting around the world with meaning and symbolic meaning and philosophy. So it turns more into a brand that's able to signal status through the philosophy behind it. It signals urban mobility, right? These kinds of people are wearing it. These cool people are wearing it. It's not necessarily just inaccessible because of its price tag. It's inaccessible maybe because of people not being able to associate with and understand why this luxury brand is doing a nylon bag, because nylon is not a very expensive textile, just so you know. And so it has symbolic meaning more than just like literally existing. We all can acknowledge that leather is hard to come by. It has an entire process in terms of production and is generally regarded as a luxury fabric and is priced as such. Whereas, like I said, it's all about the symbolic value when it comes to this shift for Prada. And that's why a lot of Prada's fashion, or the fashion that Prada was known for, was kind of this dweeby couture aesthetic, right? And this utility-based, futuristic, kind of techie looking woman with these weird, odd references in fashion. It's not a typical fashion brand. That's what makes Prada stand out as a brand, and Miu Miu as well. They're weird looking. They're weird looking in appearance because of their symbolic value and because of their relational value in fashion. Like Prada, because it doesn't look like any other fashion brand, is a brand that a lot of women were interested in going to, and men and people in between, because it's unlike other aspects of fashion. It's not this high glam fembot, right? And it's not this super basic thing. A lot of people were happy going to Prada as a brand because of how you contrast it against the rest of what was going on in fashion. They're making something that is associated with low status into a high status coveted item based on its symbolic value. Another example that I think Rebecca Arnold gives in Fashion Desire and Anxiety is Helmut Lang. So Helmut Lang in the 90s had this ability to transform basic silhouettes and basic fashion styles like the undershirt tank top, casual jeans and casual pants into these high luxe coveted fashion designs, but it's because of how they were contrasted against the rest of what was going on in fashion. So again, we're coming out of 80s opulence, moving into 1990s kind of minimalism. Fashion exists relationally, just as the way that we construct our fashion identities, it exists relationally. So because all the rest of what's going on in fashion is this very overt signaling, where it's very kind of easy to interpret what's fashionable, what's elite and luxury, when you do something that contrasts directly against that, it reshapes kind of the tone of that brand. So Rebecca Arnold writes about how Lisa Armstrong said in British Vogue, 80s snobbery may have been simplistic, but it was democratic, easily grasped by everyone. This new version has taken to its heart a completely different system of status symbols that, far from being recognized from the other end of Bond Street, couldn't be identified from next door. So it's like really difficult to interpret the codes of this because it's like blending in with regular clothes, but even like less than like regular clothes. It's like low status to normal clothes. The examples that I loved that she brings up are granny chic, which is like, to me it has two meanings. So in the 2010s and 2000s, I would consider granny chic like the silver hair trend and the gray hair trend. Tavi Gevinson, all of the Tumblr girlies, gray hair, silver hair. The only power that that style had was that young people were doing it. And it was like, why as a young person would you submit your youth in order to participate in a fashion trend? That's how you're inverting status, because you're saying, I'm gonna give up the fact that youth is like the most coveted thing in fashion and beauty and look like an old person on purpose, because when you contrast the fact that I have a young face against old hair, it creates like this ability to assert status. It's like, why risk it? It's just like if someone really pretty has short hair or someone really pretty has shaved head. It's like, why would you risk that? Why would you give up our conventional standards of beauty? And it's because when you take that risk, you get rewarded with being distinguished from other people because of the way that you're choosing to invert status and to give up something that we see as powerful and that like allows you to navigate more successfully. Another example is High Snobody just did an article about like granny dressing, where people are dressing old, like young people, like cutting edge fashion people are dressing like grandmas and grandpas, super comfy, cozy clothes, super like they say like coastal grandma or something like that. They're just dressing really like retirement home, Boca Raton chic vibes. Again, this is a way of inverting status because it goes back to, why would a young person submit their youth in order to get dressed every day? Why would you give up the fact that you're young, which is something so coveted, especially in the fashion industry? And it's because you're inverting status. You have the power to say, because I'm young, I can make this fashionable. Because I'm young, and you contrast the way that I'm dressing against the way that I am, that's where the power is created within the middle of that contrast. Another way to invert status that's really popular is dressing out of date. This is kind of what I talked about in terms of authentically interpreting fashion eras, but it's also just in general like wearing vintage fashion. I think it's a much more common risk now than maybe it used to be. But in general, if you wear vintage fashion, you are inverting status to a degree by dressing out of date. So if you're in 2023 dressing like it's the 70s, obviously we do understand that the 70s is a fashion trend, but it's still riskier than dressing, you know, whatever we have conceived as 2023 fashion, right? So it's like a less risky way that I think a lot more people are comfortable doing, especially if it's broad signaling and not like authentic interpretations. But dressing out of date is a way of inverting status. So she says it's inverting perceptions of novelty and prestige. It's the feat of being able to pull it off rather than the ability to dress in a way which is universally satisfying. Okay, the third example is poor couture or homeless chic. I obviously hate all of these terms. Like, I don't think that there is a good term for inverting status based on class signifiers, but that's too long to say. So like poor couture is like the summation of it. So what she says is social class is a status marker, inviting strategic mistakes and calculated duplicities. This is one that I think got really popular in the 2010s. We all have social negotiations about what that might look like. That's why people had such a visceral reaction to the Balenciaga destroyed sneakers, because they were like, these are shoes that look like somebody who is of low class status, homeless, houseless, whatever, would be wearing them, when realistically anybody could technically beat up their shoes until they were that ragged. Like, you could feasibly be rich and wear your shoes down to the bone, but we know that rich people have the privilege to not have to. So we also, like, that's what I'm saying, we have like social negotiations and understandings about who would be positioned to have to wear those in that way anyway. Okay, so in the book they call it like fashion slumming, jumping into someone's actual lived experience for your own satisfaction and your own curiosity and your own benefit without actually contributing to them, and using it to, and wielding it as a form of power, like the way that people would travel to different African countries and be like, just went to Africa for like missions, like trips and stuff like that, and then take pictures of like black children. It's to, you know, wield it for their own power. That's kind of what poor couture is. Or like when people move to Brooklyn and they're like upper middle class or whatever, and they're like have 15 roommates so that they can be like, I'm not a yuppie, I don't want to live in those nice apartment buildings, I want to live in a broke down apartment building because I'm like cool and I'm cutting edge. Or like art students don't tell people that they have rich parents and things like that. Fashion students don't tell people they have rich parents, and they like want to have 10 roommates just for the sake of being like, oh, like I'm not like a privileged person, I'm like just like everybody else, instead of like being grateful for their privilege. It's like a way of like taking on and trying to benefit from low class status. So that's just the way that they describe it. So what she says is that the intention is to create a deliberately distasteful aesthetic while maintaining playfulness and provocation and parody. And I think that that's something that you can see when people do it more overtly, like these extreme destroyed items, these extreme just like ragged stuff. Sometimes people say it's like a social commentary on what's wrong in the world. I kind of would contest that, because I'm like, divest from all of this entirely. Like, instead of making social commentaries with fashion, you could divest from it entirely and work to redistribute your wealth if it's so important to you. But people don't want to. They want to benefit from it in the same way as the hood tours and things like that, or using the children in their Facebook pictures to say that they're a good person. Like, if you really wanted to, you know, work towards resolution in our world, you don't have to get a claim for it, right? You don't have to get any credit for it. You could just do it. But it is something that comes back to people wanting to benefit themselves from it. Okay. I think this is where like ironic fashion comes in. There's like this general negotiated understanding that the kind of person who wears knockoffs presumably is somebody who is supposedly of low status, even though we know that very wealthy people buy fake Hermes bags all the time, as we've found out in the last few years. They are very wealthy, they buy them, they don't care. But because we have a social understanding that it's low status thing, very high status people supposedly, or companies or corporations, and the very powerful can reclaim this by undermining it. So a high luxury brand can get knocked off, and you know, let's say the brand is Versace, and then they'll spell Versace wrong, so then Versace can make a bag where Versace is spelled wrong, or like the bags that say like, this is a fake bag, this is a fake Versace, this is a fake Gucci bag on it. They're like reclaiming and undermining the fact that they get knocked off, and that we have a social understanding that that happens, like counterfeit goods occur. And so you're inverting status by accepting the counterfeit, and then reclaiming it. So you make the original, that gets abstracted as a counterfeit, you take it again and make it into an actual authentic luxury bag. Now if somebody knocks that off, that would slay, that would be even like more powerful. But you're reclaiming it by undermining it. So she says, rather than demonstrating wealth or power, social currency twists the keys and themes in fashion, like originality and luxury. What she's saying is that they're like privy or savvy to the strategies of the wrong and how they're perceived socially, so they take advantage of it to reconstruct meaning with the fashion public, because we have that understanding. So we know what knockoffs are. So when a brand knocks off a knockoff, or wears, or like makes something designer out of something cheap, it's because we know what's cheap and we know what's designer. Like the Bottega bag, or the Bottega really casual wear, like white tank top. The reason why it has power is because we know how we associate that fashion with like working class people. And so when you find out that those working class aesthetics are being reconstructed in leather and then sold by a luxury brand, it's upending what we have social understandings about and social beliefs about. Or when they have the brown paper bag, but it's made out of leather, it's upending that. And things like that. So instead of being like reconstructing meaning so literally as like the Margiela Glam Slam bag, which looks like a pillow or a cushion, it's not like deconstruction in that way where you're like completely deconstructing the meaning and making a found object into something art or fashion. It's like you're making something that has an existing understanding not outside of fashion. Like, so I called this, or like said that this was connected to post-lockdown fashion. So the runway examples are Miu Miu Fall 2023, Prada Fall 2023, Bottega Veneta, and I'll include the others on the screen. So in these instances, casual fashion or even workwear gets reframed as coveted luxury fashion items because of how they contrast against more ostentatious constructs of fashion. So fashion right now in a post-2020 lockdown world is novel. So think like the ways that people had to demonstratively communicate their meaning in fashion. It was all about demonstration. It was all about performance. It was all about like, you can tell that I'm a understander of hysteric glamour. You can tell I'm a understander of Rick Owens or whatever, because they're like overtly signaling it. It's like layering it on really, really thick in order to communicate directly what your proximity is to certain subcultures or certain fashion eras. You had to be very, very clear. That's why Y2K became really popular, because it's like very literal signaling, and same with the 2000s bling era. It became really popular because it's a way of really overtly signaling. These were like high glams. Like these were like parallel to the 80s in my opinion. Like when I was growing up, I felt like bling era fashion, like 2005, 2006 fashion was directly like the 80s. It was so like bam, in your face, out there, juicy couture on the butt. Pink, green, blue, like Powerpuff Girls colored everything. Hot pink, bright, sparkly, blingy, shiny, everything. Paris Hilton, Eve, like that kind of fashion. It was super, super in your face and it was super direct. So in the when 2020 happened and kind of into 2021, that's kind of how people were signaling. Again, relationally, the meaning is created where it becomes important in order to signal status. That's why I said like authentic era interpretations became important, because it's relational. Then you want to do the paired back thing. It's not so much now about dressing authentic to an era as much as it is dressing in a way that it relates to and is contrasted against overt signaling. It's more symbolic, and that's what makes it the Prada knapsackification. It's about meaning movement through symbols. You understand what is behind how I'm getting dressed now. I don't have to be so overt in the signaling. So that's like the mid-2000s was the 80s, we're back to the 90s. So fashion was about more overt signaling, and this form of paring back and going in the exact opposite direction and entirely divesting from trendiness has significant powers in terms of symbolic and philosophical meaning. So like the House of Sunny fashion, weird girl fashion, those necklaces that looked like summer camp, what are those? Friendship bracelets, charm bracelets, everything was super, super overt. You're communicating as literally, or like as, I would say kind of like literally, like as ostentatiously as humanly possible. You're trying to demonstrate your proximity. Now it's about moving into the symbolic instead. And like the power that that has. It's all about what's underlying. So again, this goes back to Celine, Phoebe Philo era Celine styling. I have a whole video on it. It's gonna be probably like an hour long, but there's power in saying like I'm not saying. Like you understand my complexity by what I'm not saying. So I'm leaving it open-ended for you to assign meaning to what I look like. Because when you're doing all that overt signaling, every single trend in the world and saying like, I get all of this fashion, I get 90s fashion, I get 2000s fashion, I get mid-2000s, I get Y2K, and you're putting on everything, you're trying to be interpreted as accurate, and now it's like ambiguous. You're intentionally getting dressed to be like, it's not about being accurate when I get dressed, it's about you can project whatever you want onto me because I'm allowing you to see me as complex. To me, if we ignore that this is about directly inverting status and not just like neutralizing it or having a slight shift or transition from middle to high status, it makes it seem like status means nothing and like radical fashion doesn't exist at all. and everything just exists ambiguously, and I don't think that it does. And I also don't think that it's not radical, or like not, how do I say this? I don't think that it's unintentional when people dress normal, and I don't think it's safe or healthy for people to just be like, if someone dresses normal, it's because they're divested from fashion, rather than like seeing that there's a lot of power and intention behind these ways of dressing. When we see this as like invisible and allows you see this as a way of allowing people to be seen as complex, there are racial implications, there are fatphobic implications, there are class implications. There's only a certain kind of person who can dress normal and be seen as complex. In terms of implication, I would say it's not this like radical thing necessarily. There are like power-based implications, but they're not doing it because they want to upend power. They're doing it because it's a thing to do. Granny chic in the fashion industry is not done because people believe older women, you know, should deserve more rights or better treatment, and it doesn't work to help older women get better rights or better treatment or be seen as humans. It's done because it upends an expectation. That's it. And the same is the case for all of it. Like, I could go into every single detail or crevice, but you know, like, the same is the case for all of it. And that's kind of the case that I make about people saying that they are doing old money or quiet luxury, wealth whispers. The same is the case for all of it, because I keep saying on like every platform, nobody will dress like the Olsen twins. Dress like the Olsen twins, I dare you. Just like the Olsen twins in the mid-2000s in their hobo chic era, where they actually were inverting status. Nobody will dress like that, because we know that we can't match our status in order to make it status inversion. You can't invert status that you don't have. So like, they are billionaires, they are recognizable celebrity figures. They can dress like that because they have a driver and like assistants and people around them or whatever. Maybe they don't, but like, you know what I mean? They have the wealth to back up and the notoriety socially to back up the fact that they're dressed from a different class status than they are. That's much lower than what they are. So they can invert that status. But if a normal person dresses like that, you will literally just be seen as like someone who is poor or someone who is homeless, and then you're going to be treated as such, and you have nothing to make up for it. You can't be like, well, do you know who I am? You don't have the status to invert in that situation, and that's how actual rich people have the power to do that, right? Rich people don't just have the power to dress normal or casual, like neutral, like in the middle. Like we're saying, like supposedly neutral. They don't have the power to just dress neutral. They have the power to completely invert that status, right? The same with the Balenciaga destroyed shoes. They literally have the power to do that because all the rest of their life is made up for. It's not the same thing as if you know, walk on the train wearing beat up shoes like that and people are like, ah, get away from me, don't ask me for money, you know, and they're like scared of you because of our perceptions of like poor people, homeless people, etc. You know, it's a very different thing when you don't have the power to invert. So that's how it's kind of like summed up. And that's the ability to invert status using that example. Okay, my hair smells like my shampoo. I hope that made sense. It's gonna be the longest video ever, but I hope it made sense. My stomach hurts.